Greetings, welcome to Present Your Commerce tutorials. In today's tutorial, we look at absorption costing, which is under overheads. By the end of this topic, we should be able to define absorption costing, direct, indirect, variable, and fixed costs, allocate and portion overheads between production and service departments. We're able to calculate the following absorption rates: direct labor hour rate, machine hour rate, unit cost rate. We're able to apply the absorption rates to calculate the full cost and determine the profit. Explain over and under absorption of overheads. Explain the causes of over and under absorption of overheads. So able to calculate over and under absorption of overheads. By definition, absorption costing is a method which seeks to charge a fair proportion of overhead cost to a unit of production. But also one can say that it's a method for accumulating the costs associated with the production process and apportioning them to individual products or allocated to the produced units. But I'll give you the simplest definition. You can say that it's a method of costing that charges all production costs to the units produced, which means that absorption costing does charge all production costs to the units being produced. Okay, it does take into consideration all of the production costs, the units being produced. Now think of a manufacturing entity, which is an entity that converts raw materials into finished goods. For a manufacturing entity, if you want to calculate the production cost, you have to take the direct material, you add with direct labor, add with direct expense, and then you get prime cost. And after that, you add with overheads, and you get the production cost for such an entity. You get the production cost for such an entity. Okay. Now with absorption costing, it takes into consideration all of these costs that the firm incurs in order to produce out a product. Okay. Now what we'll be doing in this topic is that we'll calculate the production cost. We'll calculate the production cost, and after getting the production cost, we'll then be able to get the profit or to determine the profit by looking at the selling price for the units produced out. Okay, what I want you to understand now is that absorption costing, it includes all the production costs, or it's a method of costing that charges all the production costs to the units being produced. Okay, that is absorption costing. Okay, now very important, we have direct costs. So costs that are directly related to the production of a product. In other words, these are costs that are directly traceable to a product. We have costs like raw materials, direct wages, or labor. All of those costs are direct costs. Okay, they are directly related or traceable to a product being produced. And we have indirect costs. Indirect costs, these are costs that are not directly related to the production process of a product. Okay, in other words, these are costs that cannot be directly traced to a specific product. We have costs like rent. Costs like rent, we cannot directly trace them to a specific product. Such a cost falls under the indirect cost. Now, these indirect costs, is what we call overheads. Is what we call overheads. Okay. Indirect costs is what we call, or what we refer to as overheads. Okay. Now, these indirect costs, they do help the production. However, in other words, they do help the entity to be able to convert the raw materials into finished goods. Because we speak of rent, for example. So rent is an indirect cost. Now with rent, if you're producing something and you're renting out the building and you're incurring the cost of rent, in order for you to produce it, you really need that building. Okay, so you have to spend money for rent. Okay, as a result, you'll be able to produce out a certain product. Now, these indirect costs are divided into two. We have variable costs and fixed costs. They fall under indirect costs, all of them. Now, with the variable cost, these are the costs that changes with direct levels of output or production. In other words, these costs do change with the level of production. The more you produce, the more you incur these costs. The less you produce, the less you incur these costs. Okay. Some of the variable costs that we have electricity. Electricity is one of the good examples of variable costs. Because if you are producing something and you're using electricity, then the more you like to produce that product, the more electricity you have to consume. And you have in the fixed costs, which are costs that stay the same regardless of the level of output of production. Now, with the fixed costs, they do not change. They always remain constant, regardless of the output produced and all it. Okay, so which means if you are producing more, this cost will remain the same. Now, variable costs and fixed costs do form part of the indirect cost, which is what you call as overheads. Okay, now if you look at the two, direct costs and indirect costs, which is what we refer to as overheads. Now, if you look at the first one, direct costs, that is where now we have direct material, direct labor, direct expense, forming prime costs. And indirect costs is where now, that is the overheads now. And the overheads is divided into two. If you continue studying accounting, or what you call in accounting as variable manufacturing overheads and fixed manufacturing overheads. Those two then form part of the overheads. Now, with absorption costing, what it seeks is that it seeks to charge all the production costs, which is the prime cost, and the overheads to the units being produced. Okay. Very important, allocation and apportionment of indirect costs. In other words, allocation and apportionment of overheads. Okay, how do we then apportion the overheads? All right, allocation is a process of identification of overheads with cost centers. Okay, so in other words, cost centers, we mean where the business spends money. Okay, where the business spends money, but it doesn't directly make money. That is what we mean as cost center. It's where the business is spending money, but it doesn't directly make money. It's only important for supporting production and business operations. That is what we mean by saying cost center. Or you can understand cost center in this way, where costs are recorded and controlled, but no direct profit is earned. Okay. Or you can say a location or function where costs are collected and monitored. But very important, when you say cost centers, we mean where the entity is spending money and where the entity spending money doesn't necessarily generate the money. It does support the production. And that is what we mean by cost centers. Okay, now when you speak of allocation of overheads, we mean allocation of overheads, we mean assigning assigning whole overheads to a single department. Okay, you give all the entire, you give all the overheads to the entire department. Okay, you assign all the overheads to that department. That is what we mean of allocation of overheads. Now, if you look at what we're told here, we're told that so it is the appointment of whole item of cost to a cost center or cost unit, or refers to the charging of expenses which can be identified wholly with a particular department. Okay, to understand what's explained here better, you can understand it in this way. When you speak of allocation of overheads, we mean assigning whole overheads to a single department. For example, if we speak of factory rent, and that factory rent, we have to allocate it, or if it belongs to production department A, which means we have to allocate it 100% to that department. That is what we mean by saying allocation of overheads. Okay, we mean aligning whole overheads to a single department. If rent belongs to the production department A, we have to allocate 100% of the rent to that department. Now we're using, or we were given some examples here, whereby we're told that the whole of overtime wages paid to workers relating to a particular department should be charged to that department. Okay, this is a very good example. Like here, we speak of overtime wages, which is paid to workers working in a particular department. Now, when it comes to allocation of the wages, we must 100% allocate the wages to that department. Similarly, again, the cost of repairs and maintenance of a particular machine should be charged to that particular department wherein the machine is located. Okay, so we should allocate to that department where the machine is located. That is where now we charge the cost of repairs and maintenance 100%. We charge it where the machine is located. In other words, we charge it to that cost center. All right, rest self-study. We also have what we call as apportionment of overheads. Apportionment of overheads or of overhead expense. Anyhow. All right, cost apportionment is the allotment of proportions of items to cost centers, cost units on some certain basis and all that. Okay, to understand apportionment of overheads, okay, this one is self-study, you can go through on your own. But what I want you to understand is apportionment of overheads or of overhead expenses. Apportionment of overhead expenses, we mean sharing the overhead expenses between two or more departments. It can be a production department, it can be a service department using fair basis. Okay, so there are some basis of apportionment that we use as we share the overhead between different departments, normally between service and production departments. We share based on certain basis. Okay, what we call as basis of apportionment. Okay, we'll look at it as we continue going through these slides. Okay, commonly we share overheads like rent and rates, depreciation, repairs, maintenance, lighting, works manager salary, etc. So we apportion it between different departments. So what I want you to understand is the difference between allocation and apportionment of overhead expenses. Allocation of overhead expenses, we mean assigning whole overheads to a single department. In other words, you give 100% of the overheads to that department. If it belongs to Department A, we give it to Department A, 100%. If it belongs to Department B, we give it to Department B, 100%. While apportionment of overheads, we mean sharing the overheads between two different departments using fair basis, what we call as basis of apportionment. And normally we do that between service and production departments. Now we're given an example here. We're given a good example here. We're told that Argon is a manufacturing business divided into 3 separate departments: machining, finishing, and stores. Okay, and what I want us to look at, we are given depreciation, lighting, plant, insurance, rent, supervision. And we're told that the following information is available for the 3 departments. Now, the machining department, fishing department, and stores department. And what I want us to do is to know which one is a production department and which one falls under the service department. Now, obviously, machining and finishing should be, yes, finishing. Machining and finishing, those ones are production department, whilst those obviously is a service department. All right, given, okay, so we're given a good table here on the basis we allocate our overheads. Sorry, on the basis we apportion our overheads, the basis of apportionment. So these are the basis of apportionment. Now, if it's rent, we apportion it based on the floor space. If it's depreciation of plant, we apportion it based on the value of plant. If it's light and heating, we use the floor space. Plant insurance, we use value of plant. If it's supervision, you use the number of employees. So what does that mean? It means that we must know the basis of apportionment. Okay, we must know the basis of apportionment. Now, if we get to know the basis of apportionment, then we'll be able to apportion overhead expenses between the production and service departments. All right, if it's not, depends on the question. Sometimes the questions will be given how the overhead expenses are being apportioned between the service and the production department. Okay, you might sometimes be given that, whereby you might be told that rent is apportioned based on the floor space and supervision is apportioned based on number of employees. Okay, but to be on the safe side, just know type of overheads and the basis of apportionment we use. All right, our question is then asking us to apportion the cost to 3 departments using the using the most suitable basis. Clearly state the basis you used or we have used. Okay, the table below can assist us in correctly allocate or allocation apportionment of overheads. Okay, so this table then assisting us. Okay, so very important, know the types of overheads and the basis of apportionment. So that is very important to do. All right, what we then have to do in answering this question, remember what we're doing is we are apportioning the overheads. Which ones are the overheads here? Depreciation of plant, that is an overhead. Lightning, plant, rent, salaries to supervisors or supervision is an overhead. These are indirect costs, what you call as overheads. And we have to apportion between the 3 different departments. Okay. We have to apportion the 3 different departments. Good. Now let's do it and pay more attention. So for depreciation, if you look at the amount for depreciation, is 6,000. Okay. The amount for depreciation is 6,000. And the basis of apportionment that we use for depreciation is the value of plant. We use the value of plant. Good. Now, let's look at the value of plant. The value of plant for the 3 different departments. We have 86 for machining, and 8 for finishing, and 2 for stores. These are the 3 different values for the plant. Now, what we have to do to apportion the depreciation of 6,000 between the different departments. Now, what you have to do is to focus more on the basis of apportionment. We are using the value of plant. So what you have to do then is take the 86, add it with the 8, add it with the 2, and get the total. And that is 96. You see? Now, with our apportionment, it will be very easier. For depreciation, we just have to take the 6,000 and then multiply it by 86 over 96, because 96 is a total. So you have to take 86 and divide it by 96, and you multiply by 6,000. Then you apportion to the machining department. When it comes to finishing department, you take the 8 and then you divide by 96 and multiply it by 6,000, just like that. Okay. If you look at our workings for machining, like I said, we took the 6,000 and multiply it by the value of plant for machining, since we're using the value of plant to apportion depreciation. So we take the 86 and divide it by 96. So we're going to get 5,375 Namibian dollars. Finishing, you take the 60,000, take the 6,000, and multiply it by 8 over 96. 96 is a total. 8 over 96, then you get 500. And stores, you take the 2 and divide it by the total, which is 96, and then multiply it by 6,000. And you're going to get 125. So 125 plus 500 plus 5,375 plus 125, that's going to give us 6,000. That is to say now that depreciation has been apportioned between the three different departments. You can see the foremost thing is to know the basis of apportionment. You get it? Or in other words, we must know how are we sharing the overhead expenses between the different departments. Okay, and this is our overhead basis of apportionment. This is how we apportion the overheads. Okay, we apportion them in this way. So you must master this. All right, we go to lighting and heating. If we go to this overhead, it is 4,500. And the basis of apportionment we're using for light and heating is floor space. We're using the floor space for lighting and heating. Okay. Our floor space then in this question is this one here, floor area. For machining is 5,000. For finishing is 4.5. For stores is 500. That is our floor space or floor area. So what we have to do then is we take the total of the floor space for the three different departments. That is 5,000 plus 4.5 plus 500. So that's going to give us 10,000. So that's going to give us 10,000. Now, to apportion lighting and heating, since we're using the floor area or floor space, so to apportion it between the three different departments, what we have to do then is we take the 5,000 and divide it by the 10,000. And thereafter, you multiply it by 4.5. The answer you get is the amount you apportion to machining. Then you take 4.5, divide it by total, and multiply it by 4.5. The answer you get is how much you apportion to finishing. We take 500, divide by 10,000, and multiply by the amount for lighting and heating. Okay. So that's exactly what we did. And for machining, we get this amount, finishing this amount. If we add the three amounts, it will give us 4.5. Okay. Okay, same again with some other overheads. Same again with some other overheads. Like, let's go to planned and insurance. So for planned insurance, the basis of apportionment we're using, planned insurance, we're using the value of planned. So to apportion insurance, we're using the value of planned, which means we just have to take the value of planned. Let's say for machining, we take 86 and divide it by total, and then multiply by 4.8. And for finishing, you take 8/96, which is the total. You multiply it by 4.8, just like that. And rent, we're using floor space, which means you take 5,000 and divide it by the total, which is 10,000, and multiply it by 18,000, and the answer you get it will be for machining. And for finishing, we take 4.5 and divide it by the total of the floor space, which is 10,000, and multiply it by the amount of 18,000. The answer we get is the rent apportioned to finishing department. For supervision, since we're using number of employees, what we have to do is we take the number of employees, that is 12, plus 8, plus 5, that is 25. To apportion this amount of 25,000 to machining, we take 12 over the total of 25, and we multiply it by 25,000. The answer you get is what we apportion to the machining department for supervision. Then finishing, you take 8, then divide it by the total and apply just like that. Okay, so it's very easier to do. All you need to do is to master the basis of apportionment. Okay, once you master the basis of apportionment, then you'll be able to to apportion different overheads to various departments. All right, if you look at, okay, and also, let's look at the reapportionment of service departments overheads among production departments. Okay, so we have to reapportion the service departments overheads among production departments. So just exactly the same thing we did. So for depreciation of plant, just know the basis of apportionment. The total amount is 6,000, lighting and heating. Total amount is 4.5. We're using floor area here for space, plant insurance, rent, and all that. Just know the basis of apportionment, the total, then you apportion between the 3 departments. Okay, which is exactly what I emphasize on lately. All right, continue. Service cost centers are those that exist to provide services to other cost centers in the organization. Though they do not work directly on producing the product, many production departments relies on the services from this cost center. As a result, their costs must be reapportioned to production cost centers so that their overheads can be absorbed into the final product. Okay. Now, what we're doing or what we should do when we do the reapportionment, there's the reapportionment of overheads. When you do the reapportionment of overheads, what we have to do is that the overheads that were apportioned to the service departments, the overheads that were apportioned to the service department, which is this overheads here, that's apportioned to the service department, we must reapportion it to the manufacturing or to the production departments. Let me say it that way. Okay, we must reapportion it to the production department so that we're able to, so that their overheads can be absorbed into the final product. Okay, so, okay, sorry for that. In this table, what we did, we just apportioned the overheads between the 3 departments. We just apportioned the overheads between the 3 departments. This is not reapportionment. So now, after apportioning between the 3 departments, what we have to do then is to reapportion the the overheads of service departments among the production departments. In other words, since this one is a service department here, there are some overheads apportioned to the service department. There are some overheads apportioned to the service department. Now, what we have to do then is to reapportion the service department overheads to the to the production departments, so that we can able to absorb their overheads into the final product. Okay. All right. Let us look at then the next one. How can we then reapportion the overheads for the service department, which is for stores? Stores is the service department in this case. How do we then reapportion this into the production departments, which is machining and finishing, which is what we're trying to look at. All right. We must reapportion stock cost, which is the service department, to each production department, which is the machining and the finishing department, on the basis of the number of orders. Okay, we must reapportion to the production department on the basis of number of orders. We must bear that in mind, and you will always be told on which basis must you reapportion the service department into the production department. So in this case, we are portioning based on the number of orders, which means that everything that we are portioned to the service department, we must reapportion it to the production departments based on the number of orders. Now, if we look at the total amount that is apportioned to the stores, which is the service department, is 6,350 Namibian dollars. So what we then have to do is go to the number of orders is given in the question. Now, the number of orders from stores for machining is 3,600. For finishing is 1,480. So what we need then, what we have to do then is take the 3.6 and add it with this amount here. Okay. So 3.6 plus 1,480, that is 3.6 plus 1,480, that is 580 is the total. Okay, the total for the two. So now what we have to do then is to take the 3.6 and then divide it by the total. You get it? We take 3.6 and divide it by the total, and then multiply by the total overheads allocated, apportioned to the service department. That is what we're gonna do. Same again when it comes to finishing. We will take this amount and divide it by the total overheads for the service department. Okay, so this is our total service department overheads. So what we then have to do is okay, so for machining, we take the number of orders, which is 3.6. We take 3.6, then divide it by the total, like I said, of the number of orders, and then multiply it by the total overheads of the service department, which is this one here. Now, if you do that, then you get a 4.5. So we allocate to the machining department just like that. And when it comes to the finishing department, we take the number of orders for this department. How many orders we got? The number of orders were this one, and divided by total, which is this, and then multiply it by the overheads for the service department, the total. So that's gonna give us 18. That's gonna give us 1850 or 1850. Okay. And the other thing again, if we look at the overheads allocated to the production department, apportioned to the production department for machining is 32,925. You take it the way it is, then finishing, you take it the way it is. Then after that, you add. Okay, you add 19,025 plus 1850. That is this amount. Should be this side. And then this side, we must have 32,925 plus 45. Okay, 37,425. Okay, just like that. Then you are done. Okay, so just to emphasize on the apportionment of overheads. How do we apportion overheads? On the apportionment of overheads, how do we apportion overheads? So the apportion of overheads, it means sharing overheads between two different departments. Normally between production departments and the service department. What we then have to do first is to apportion for the departments. Like in this case, we apportioned for 3 departments, including the service department. Okay, how do you get to know that this one is a service department? This department doesn't involve in the production of goods. Or yes, let me say it that way. Doesn't involve in the production of goods, such as stores. Everything is being done in these departments, and then in the stores department, we just store the goods there. You see? So what we have to do first is to apportion to all the 3 departments. When we apportion to 3 departments, we must know the basis of apportionment. Now, the basis of apportionment are given here, which means that is the way you now have to share your overheads between the different departments. Like here, it was floor space for rent, which meant we needed the floor space. Then for machining, we just take 5,000, divide by the total, then multiply by rent. Finishing, just take this, divide by the total of floor space, you multiply just like that. And when you take the rent figure, that is apportioned to the 3 departments, to exactly give us 18,000. And you are highly encouraged to use such a table. Now, after apportioning to different departments, including the service department, what we then have to do is to reapportion the service department overheads to the production departments so that the overheads or the service department overheads can be absorbed into the final product. Now, how do we then reapportion? We reapportion based on a certain basis, and mostly you'll be told on which basis must you reapportion. So in this case, we are told on the number of orders, which means we have to take the number of orders, the total, then 3.6, we divide it by the total and multiply by the total overheads for the service department. Okay, that is what we need to do. All right, we then look at the calculation of different absorption rates. Okay, remember here uh, we are talking about a manufacturing entity. Like I said, here we're talking about a manufacturing entity, right? Prime cost. I believe by now we know what prime cost consists of. Equals to production cost. Okay, so what we're doing then is we're looking for the production cost, okay, for all the units produced, and that is absorption costing. Okay, all right. What to then do, especially on the overheads? What we do on the overheads is that we allocate, or we apportion, let me just use apportion. We apportion these overheads based on different rates. Okay, these overheads you are seeing here, we apportion based on different absorption rates. And that is what now we're gonna look at. The first rate is the direct labor rate, where the production processes are labor intensive and they have relatively little machine usage. This method is appropriate, suitable when production is carried out manually. Now, in departments where the production requires a lot of labor, the right rate to use to apportion the overheads is the direct labor hour rate. Now, that formula looks like this. You take the total overheads, then divide it by the total number of hours. Then you know how much will you allocate, okay, the labor hour. And also direct machine hour. So this one is suitable when production is capital intensive and machines play a major part in the manufacturing process. Suitable when machines are extensively used in the production. Now, if machines are used in the production in that department, then the suitable rate or absorption rate to use is the direct machine hour rate. You just take the total factory overheads, manufacturing overheads, and then divide it by the number of hours. Unit cost rate, this one is suitable when only one type of product is produced and all the units of output are uniform in all respects. If different products are produced of the units of output are of different size, grade, quality each, this method is not suitable. That is to say now that the unit cost rate is only suitable when only one product or one type of product is being produced and all the units of output are uniform in all respects. That is the time now we use the unit cost rate, whereby we need to take the factory overheads, then divide by the number of units produced. Okay. Now, you must know when to use these absorption rates. You must know when to use them. Okay. This one, where the production process requires a lot of labor. This one, where the production process requires a lot of capital. And this one, where where it's on the production of a certain type of a product. Okay, that's where now you use this rate. So they are so easy to use. You just take the total overheads and then divide by the total number of hours, for instance, in this case. And then you allocate, you apportion accordingly. Allocate accordingly. Okay, Continue. Okay, application of absorption rates in calculation of full cost and determine profit. Okay, according to the type of cost, cost accounting system, in the production, costs are based on the total costs. Okay, which means since we're using, which means absorption costing, like I said in the beginning, it includes all the costs of production, determine the total cost, which is the direct cost and the indirect cost, which is what you call overhead costs. The overheads are absorbed into the cost of production or total factory cost, that is overhead cost now, by apportioning the costs to cost centers where they are absorbed by using absorption rates. For example, if one product is to be made and the production is labor intensive, then an overhead rate per unit can be found by this formula. This rate that is calculated is used to calculate the fixed cost of that one particular product that is then added to the unit's direct expenses to give a total unit cost. Like I mentioned, our absorption rates are very important because that overhead that we add to the prime cost and get the total production cost, we must apportion based on different absorption rates depending now on the production. If the production requires labor, or if the production is labor intensive, which means we must use this absorption rate. Now, when we get this absorption rate, then you can able to apportion the overheads properly to the production. Okay. Over and under absorption of overheads. Over absorption of overheads, start with it. This is the excess of overheads absorbed over the actual amount of overheads incurred. Each when the amount absorbed is more than the expenditure incurred due to expenses being less than the estimate, then that is what we know, or that is what we call by saying over absorption of overheads. If what is absorbed, or if the overheads absorbed are more than the actual amount of overheads incurred, then that is over absorption of overheads. When you speak of overhead absorbed, we mean estimated overhead charged to product. Okay, the estimated overheads that are charged to the product, while actual overheads are the real overheads incurred by the business. Are you getting that? That's more like the overhead absorbed is an estimate, and the actual overheads is the real overhead that the business incurred. Now, if what the business estimated, which is what we call as overhead absorbed, is more than what they incurred in reality, that is what we call as actual overheads, then that is over absorption of overheads. Now, if we also have under absorption of overheads, that is now if the amount of overheads absorbed in the production is less than the amount of actual overheads incurred. For example, if overheads are understated because the costs as the overheads incurred are not fully recovered in the cost of jobs or processes each. Now, under absorption of overheads, what happens is that the estimated overheads, which is what we call as overhead absorbed, are less than the actual overheads. Then that is under absorption. Okay. So this one, overhead absorbed more than actual overheads, then that is over absorption. And this one here, overhead absorbed less than actual overheads, then that is under absorption of overheads. Okay, we have an example here. Let's look at this example. We are told that the following information relates to commerce, manufacturing business. We have the budgeted. I think that is the budgeted. It's not the actual, but budgeted. That is an estimate now. That is an estimate. And the actual. So for overheads, we have 12,000 being budgeted, but only 13,000 were incurred. Direct wages given, direct materials given, and direct labor hours or given, machine hours are given, unit produced are given, both budgeted and actual amounts. Absorption rates and absorption costs are calculated using labor hour rate. And mostly you'll be given the rate on how the absorption cost. Okay, you'll be given the rate on how the absorption costs are calculated. So you don't have to stress about which one is appropriate and all that. Mostly you'll be given, but we're using labor hour rate or machine hour rate or unit rate and all that. You'll be given on how this business calculates their absorption cost. Okay, now we are asked to analyze and comment on the absorption of overheads. We are asked to analyze and comment on the absorption of overheads. Now remember our formula. Since we're using direct labor hour, what we have to do then is to take, right, for you this formula, take the budgeted overheads, and then you divide by direct labor hours. This is what you have to do, which is this formula given here. Okay, so we take our budgeted overheads and then divide by direct labor hours. If you look at our overheads, the budgeted ones, 12,000, and labor hours, 1.6. Budgeted is 4,000, and labor hours, or direct labor hours, is 1.6. So what we then have to do to get our absorption rate, we take the budgeted overheads, which is 12,000, and then divide it by 1.6. We're gonna get $7.50 per labor hour. That's what it means. Okay, now this is the rate that we should use to get the overhead amount absorbed, or to get the absorbed overhead we must use this rate. Okay. Now, if you look at the question given, if we look at the question given here, we're given that the actual direct labor hours is 1,575. So that means you must take the 1,100, sorry, 1,575, and then multiply it by the rate. Okay. And the amount you get here, then that is the amount of overhead absorbed. Okay, that is the amount of overhead absorbed. Okay, we're told that whereas the actual overhead is 13,000, but the budgeted overhead and calculated as what was this amount, which is this one here. It clearly shows that there was an under absorption of overheads. Okay, so let's look at that again. Now, if you look at here, if you look at this question, we're using direct labor rate or labor rate in hours to calculate the absorption rate. So what we have to do then is to take the budgeted. We always take the budgeted, okay? We don't take the actual, but we always take the budgeted. We take the budgeted overheads and divide it by the actual number of labor hours, which is 1.6. And you're gonna get $7.5 per labor hour. So that means to get our actual, to get our budgeted overheads, or to get the overhead absorbed to production, what we have to do then is to take the actual labor hours, which is this amount, and then multiply it by this rate. And the amount we're gonna get, which is this amount here, then is regarded as the overhead absorbed. So the overhead absorbed is this amount. So this is the overhead absorbed. This is the overhead absorbed. Okay. And also, if we look at the actual overheads, is, just write it, the actual overheads, 13,000, that is our actual overheads. Actual overheads, that is 13,000. And if we look at our budgeted overheads, which is this that we've gotten here now, okay, this amount, 11,812.50 cents. That is our budgeted overheads. That's our budgeted overheads. Now, if you look at the budgeted overheads and the actual overheads, now you will notice that there is under absorption. So you'll notice that there is under absorption. How do we know that it is under absorption? Because the budgeted overheads are less than the actual overheads. Let me just take you back. The amount of overheads absorbed in the production is less than the amount of actual overheads incurred. Okay, so the actual overheads here is 13,000, and the budgeted overheads, which is what we calculated, is this one, which is less than the actual overheads. Therefore, the difference in the amounts is under absorption. The difference then is this amount. This is a difference and it's under absorption. Now, what does it mean? Or just to emphasize on. So to emphasize, we must pay more attention on how the business or which rate is the business using for the absorption cost. Now, in this case, the business is using direct labor rate, which means we must take the budgeted overheads and divide by the budgeted direct labor hours. And after doing that, we get the rate per labor hour, and we take that rate and multiply it by the actual overheads. Sorry, by the actual direct labor hours, which is 1,575. And after doing that, the amount you get here is the overhead absorbed. This is the overhead absorbed. So the difference between the overhead absorbed and the actual overhead will then be under absorption of overhead. What does it mean? It means that the actual was more than the absorbed, or the absorbed was less than the actual. Okay. All right. We look at causes of over and under absorption of overheads. Why does it happen that way? Okay. The common reason is because there is wrong estimation of overhead expenses. Now, the actual overhead expenses may be less or maybe more than the estimated amount. Okay. Wrong estimation of work done. The amount of work done may exceed or may be less than the estimated work. Okay, just wrong estimation of work done. And also, it can be error in using methods of absorption. Might be that the method may not be suitable if the percentage of direct material method is used. Fluctuation in prices of material may lead to under or over absorption of overheads. Also, seasonal fluctuation in overhead. Due to seasonal nature of work, overhead may fluctuate from one period to another. And under or overutilization of capacity may happen due to under or overutilization of productive capacity, and also wrong estimation of output when the actual output is substantially differs from the expected output. Okay, those are the reasons why we might end up having the over and under absorption of overheads. Okay, and here, okay, however, we also have this. Okay, let's go through this. Calculate under absorption of overheads, which is exactly what we did. Overhead absorption refers to the process of allocating or applying overhead cost to products or services. Over absorption and under absorption occur when the actual overhead incurred do not match the overhead costs absorbed or allocated to the products or services. Calculate over and under absorption of overheads. You need the following information. You need the actual overhead costs, like what you had in the previous question. This is the total overhead costs incurred by the business during a specific accounting period, such as a month or year, budgeted or predetermined overhead rate, which is now the one or the rate we're calculating, the absorption rate. So this is the rate used to allocate overheads to products or services. It is usually calculated by dividing the budgeted or estimated overhead by a suitable overhead allocation base. Okay, then this brings us to the end of absorption costing. Okay, very important. Just know that absorption costing is the method of costing that includes all the production costs used or incurred to produce certain units of goods. Okay, it includes everything, which I mean direct labor, direct material, direct expense, and this is the prime cost, what we call prime cost, plus the overheads. So our focus then is on the overheads to get production costs. Absorption costing includes everything, okay, to get the production cost or cost for certain products. Now, our focus, yes, very important, is on our